The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. That very day, the first day of the week, 2 of Jesus' disciples were going to a village 7 miles from Jerusalem called Emmaus, and they were conversing about all the things that had occurred. And it happened that while they were conversing and debating, Jesus himself drew near and walked with them, but their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing as you walk along?" They stopped, looking downcast. One of them, Cleophas, said to him in reply, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know of the things that have taken place there in these days?" And he replied to them, "What sort of things?" They said to him, "The things that happened to Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, how our chief priests and rulers both handed him over to a sentence of death and crucified him. But we were hoping that he would be the one to redeem Israel. And besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since this took place. Some women from our group, however, have astounded us. They were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body. They came back and reported they had seen a vision of angels who announced that he was alive. Then some of those with us went to the tomb and found things just as the women had described, but him they did not see." And he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets spoke. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them what referred to him in all the scriptures. As they approached the village to which they were going, he gave the impression that he was going on farther. But they urged him, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening and the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. And it happened that while he was with them at table, he took bread, said the blessing, broke it, and gave it to them. With that their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, but he vanished from their sight. Then they said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he spoke to us on the way and opened the scriptures for us?" So they set out at once and returned to Jerusalem, where they found gathered together the 11 and those with them who were saying, "The Lord has truly been raised and has appeared to Simon." Then the 2 recounted what had taken place on the way and how he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The Gospel of the Lord. Good morning, everyone. One of my favorite priests in this diocese is a priest by the name of Father Brian Shota, and I'm sure that name probably won't mean much to most of you. But he entered my life when I was about halfway through the seminary in 1983. And I'll never forget, my first look at him, he was not a pretty sight. He's a big old burly, pot-bellied redneck from Bluefield with a big chaw tobacco in his mouth, and they called him country because he had those thick country Bluefield accent. But he was incredibly bright. He was a historian, a true historian. And so after his first year in the seminary, he wasn't at all happy about how he had been welcomed into the seminary. He thought it was kind of a cool place. So Brian did what Brian would do. He volunteered to be on the orientation committee, the welcoming committee for the next class to come up. But he also volunteered to be the manager of our seminary pub. Now, the pub was a sacred place to us seminarians, you see. It was in the basement. They made us go in the basement. It wasn't a real big place, but you could go there and get soft drinks or beer and sandwiches you could heat up in this oven they had. And Brian, being from Bluefield, insisted that on the bar would be a huge gallon jug of pickled eggs. Now, the guys from Jersey and Philly thought that was gross. But there's old Brian. Well, so this particular year, we had a large crop of new seminarians coming in, and especially a lot of guys that came from the Diocese of Dubuque, Iowa, the Midwest. And so Brian came up with this idea that he was going to have a crab feast for these guys while they were there and show them a little bit about Baltimore, you know? And I'm all for that because I'm addicted to crabs. And so he got somebody, he suckered him into buying 3 bushels of steamed crabs. And so we set out this crab feast down in the pub. We put newspaper on the tables just like you'd go to Baltimore and get it and all that. And so all these guys came in this particular evening. And what Brian didn't take into account was these boys were from the Midwest. They were from beef country. They didn't know what crabs were. And so here they are, and I'll never forget some of them, were saying, ooh, this is just too much work. How do you do this? And so I spent that evening, less time eating, stuffing my face with crabs, showing these guys how to dissect a crustacean. So by the time the evening was over, and these guys all went to bed, we were very much aware that we had 2.5 bushels of crabs left. So Brian looks at me and says, Jim, what are we going to do with all these crabs? I said, Brian, it would be a mortal sin to throw these things out. I will not allow that to happen. He said, I know what we'll do. We're going to shuck these things. I said, Brian, do you know how long it's going to take me to shuck 2.5 bushels of crabs? No, he said, let's just get the lump crab meat out of the shoulder part. We'll do that. And he said, and I said, well, what are you going to do with it? He said, we'll make crab soup. And I said, well, that's a great idea. I like crab soup. No problem. So Brian and I sat there to 2:30 in the morning, shucking 2.5 bushels of crabs. And we came up with 2 huge containers of pearly white, beautiful lump crab meat, which would have cost you, a couple $100 if you went and bought it. So off Brian went with his crab meat. A few days passed. I got busy with seminary life. And then I had heard in the hallways that Brian had gotten the flu. So I thought, being the senior guy from West Virginia, I'd go check on him. So I knocked on the door, and anytime you knocked on his door, you were usually getting him out of bed. And so sure enough, you could hear the grizzly bear on the other side, and he opens up the door, and he looked like death warmed over, but he had his chaw tobacco in the mouth. And I said, you doing okay? He said, yeah, I've had the flu and all this kind of stuff. He said, but I'm getting it over okay. And I said, Brian, while I'm here, what'd you ever do with that crab meat? He said, I've got it in the refrigerator. I said, well, Brian, it's been sitting there almost a week. He said, I'll be fine. I'll make that crab meat, just as soon as I get up this weekend. And I said, Brian, I think it's supposed to be pasteurized. Otherwise, it doesn't hold more than a couple days. I'll be all right, Sobus. You worry too much. Okay. Well, a few days passed. It was Friday night. I had a huge amount of research work to do. My room was on the 3rd floor, Brian's was on the 4th floor, and my room was on the area next to the elevator shaft. And every Friday, precisely at 9 p.m., I could hear Brian going down the elevator. He'd go into the basement where the pub was. He'd open the door. He'd ring this big brass bell that was there and make this war whoop. And that was the sign that the pub was open. So he opened up. I waited a few minutes, and then I caught the elevator, and I went down because I wanted to get a Pepsi. I opened up the door to the pub, and I thought I had stuck my head in a morgue. It smelled like a whole room full of dead human beings. You've never smelled anything till you smelled rotten crab meat. So here's Brian with this big metal crock on the bar, 8 cans of cannibal vegetable soup opened up. He's stirring this stuff with his chaw tobacco, and I looked over and I said, Brian, what in the name of the Lord are you doing? He said, what are you talking about? I'm making crab soup. I said, Brian, can't you smell? Smell what? I said, that stuff is rotten. He said, I ain't rotten, you're paranoid, Sobus. I said, Brian, that stuff is deadly. You think so? I said, yeah. I said, if you make crab soup out of that, you're going to make a lot of boys sick. I said, we're going to talk this out, Miss Sir. Well, he was all upset with me about that, but thank God. Can you imagine being welcomed to the seminary your first year while you're in the intensive care unit of the local hospital? That's how not to welcome people. Which leads us to our gospel today. This passage is one, there have been books written about it, there have been retreats given about it. There's actually a priest support group called the Emmaus Support Group. Articles have been written, both scholarly and non-scholarly. A lot of people have talked about this passage because it's a beautiful Easter story. And as the story opens up once again, the disciples, their faith is absolutely a mess. Two of them are leaving Jerusalem with the agony of defeat all over their faces. All of a sudden, a stranger walks along with them. Now we know who it is. It's the risen Lord. And because of their faith, they don't recognize him. And so he kind of butts into their conversation and he says, "What are you all talking about?" And they look at him almost incredulous. "Are you the only person in Jerusalem," they say, very snottily, "the only person that doesn't know what's happened there?" And he simply says, "What things?" And so they begin to tell him about this Jesus of Nazareth. They had pinned all their hopes on him, and he died just like every other human being, they thought. And so Jesus calls them foolish, and then he begins to explain to them how this all had to happen in the Old Testament. It all foretold this. And then something happens. They begin to look and realize, you know how you're walking along with somebody and you lose time. They begin to realize that the sun's going down. And as this translation says that you just heard so weakly, the translation is very weak. It says that they realized that it was getting late and they urged him to come inside their house. Actually, the Greek verb biazame means they forced him. It's almost as though they grabbed him by the arm and pulled him in. And there, once inside the house, he takes bread and he blesses it and he breaks it, and they recognize him, and Jesus vanishes. Now, so much emphasis has been put on the breaking of the bread, and you can give all kinds of talks about the Eucharist, all kinds of talks about the Eucharist, and that's a wonderful thing. But I have never seen an author yet who has ever talked about perhaps the most important point of this story. So don't tell anybody, because I'll write it in an article someday. The most important part, there would have been no breaking of the bread had they not shown hospitality to the stranger. That had to come first before he would have broken the bread. Why did they remember to invite him inside? Why? They had forgotten everything else that he told them, but they remembered this one thing. Well, you see, among the ancient Israelites, the Jewish people, there was a powerful and childlike belief based on the scripture from the book of Genesis chapter 32, verse 23. And here's what it said. God sometimes visits the earth, and he visits the earth by sending angels to the earth. And the angels take the appearance of human beings. So look at Kobe over there. She's an angel. We don't know for sure. And so the point was this: since you don't know whether this person is God's angel or not, or God, his very presence, always treat this person with hospitality and respect. Because if you reject this person, guess what? You're cutting off God, and that's not a good thing to do. But then there's another scripture that's very important. In Matthew 25, verse 35, we always hear when Jesus in this passage talks about our judgment and the criteria on which we're going to be judged when we leave this life. And we know the one about, when did you see me hungry and feed me? When did you see me naked and clothe me? When did you see me thirsty and give me drink? But how often we forget the one about, when did you see me a stranger and welcome me? You see, how we treat the stranger, the way we treat the hungry, the way we treat the naked, the way we treat the thirsty, how you treat the stranger is going to determine where you spend eternity. And so this commandment was obviously very important to the disciples and should be to us as well. Hospitality. Had there not been hospitality, they would have missed the opportunity to see Jesus. Pure and simple. So what can we say about hospitality? You know, one of the things we are instituting here at Our Lady of Fatima is a comprehensive ministry of hospitality. We got a lot of work to do, and it's going to take some time, and we will get there. But I know there will be hurdles. I remember up in Wheeling, when I first went to St. Michael's as the associate back in 1988, that was the coldest place I'd ever been in my life. It was cold. That first weekend, nobody welcomed me. It was amazing. Not that I expected a parade or anything, but I thought, you know, do they know that I'm the associate pastor? Or do they think I'm one of those visiting missionaries passing through? And I remember one time when the pastor at the time, who was Father Schmidt, who had just become Bishop Schmidt, we were having dinner one day at the supper table, and we were taking our dirty dishes to the sink. And he was looking out the window, and I could tell there was something profound going to come out of his mouth. And he said to me, "Jim, make sure you don't talk about anybody in this parish while you're here." I said, "Oh, okay." And I said, "May I ask why?" He said, "Because they're all related to one another." I've never seen a parish like that where so many families were related to one another, and he was related to about half of them. It was amazing. You go to it, you do a funeral, you do a wedding, you do a baptism, the same groups of people, add a couple, subtract a couple, were at each place all the time. They were all related. It was amazing. And that's a wonderful thing, to have a big parish family that's a family. But the downside was tragic. You know, as families, we do things together. We don't even think twice about it. Christmas Day, you go to Grandma's house. Everybody goes. Nobody needs an invitation. You go, it's a matter of what you're going to bring. You're going to bring potato salad, you're going to bring ham, what are you going to bring? Everybody goes. We just know that. We do it for Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving. We do it for Mother's Day, Father's Day, graduations, First Communions, and all that stuff. But what happened up there in the process, while people were just being what was natural to them, family, they were forgetting about the stranger that came in to the Wheeling community. Several people left that parish and left Wheeling because they didn't feel welcomed at all. Nobody did it intentionally. It's just you do things together as a family. It's a natural thing, and it's a good thing. We need family. But they forgot about the stranger. Nobody ever invited these people over for Christmas, for Thanksgiving, for a graduation, or whatever. One of the things, too, about the ministry of hospitality, I remember our first step was to get greeters at the church. So I called this big meeting for people who wanted to be greeters, and there were about 50 people that showed up. And I remember I was talking to them about welcoming people at the door and how it was going to be done properly. Well, this one usher we had, he was a big, tall man, about 6'8", good-sized guy, very intimidating and mean as a snake. At one point, he raised his hand and I said, "Yeah?" And he said, we were talking about greeting people. He said, "Oh, we've done this for years." I said, "Oh, really?" Yeah, this ain't nothing new. We've done this before." He said, "I've been here usher for over 30 years and handed out bulletins and stuff." I said, "That's my point. You hand out bulletins the way state troopers hand out speeding tickets on I-64. Now, we have the associate detachment commander of the state police here, Sergeant Mike. Excuse me. We're still friends, right? My point is, shoving a bulletin in somebody's face doesn't get it. It just doesn't get it. We can do better than that. And so people will say, "Well, how are you supposed to greet people? How would you welcome somebody into your home? Where are the bathrooms? What are you serving? What's going on here? Are you proud and happy and grateful to have that person in your home?" Something else happened. It's a problem that we can deal with. We can deal with it. It's going to take some creative strategies. But one of the problems is because we have so many masses here at Fatima. Someone who comes to the 5:30 Mass, a woman, and who's there more than I am on Saturdays, that's how faithful she is, was telling me a funny story that happened at the dentist's office. She was at her dentist's office waiting to get in to see her dentist, and there was another woman, and they were sitting around the table there where the magazines are and all that. And so they struck up in a conversation about religion and faith because of the cover story of one of the magazines. And so this woman who goes to the 5:30 Mass got up the gumption to ask this other lady what her religious affiliation was. And so she smiled pleasantly and said, "I'm a Roman Catholic." I said, "Well, I am too." He said, "Well, where do you go to church?" She said, "Our Lady of Fatima." She said, "Well, I do too." The problem? The one lady had been going over 30 years to the 8 o'clock Mass at Our Lady of Fatima, and the other one went to the 5:30 Mass at Our Lady of Fatima, and they didn't even know one another. It's amazing. And I'm prepared to hear what I've heard in the past too. "I've been going to this church since before you were born. I don't need anybody welcoming me." Yes, you do. Because I remember one time a long-term parishioner came in. And she came into that church, and after Mass, she stopped by to see me. That particular Sunday was the 20th anniversary of her husband's death. When she walked into church that day, filled with emotion, someone welcomed her, and it made all the difference in the world that day. And I remember one time hearing the confession of a woman who came in to confess she had had an abortion. That's nothing new. That happens all the time. The reason she came into confession was actually because the parish was inhospitable. She went to the church. It took her a lot to go to the church because she'd been away from the church for years. And she said when she sat in the pew clear to the back, she felt like there were eyeballs looking at her all over the place. She felt that people were judging her because she had had an abortion, but nobody knew she had. She needed welcomed, is what she needed. So my brothers and sisters, these men in our gospel today would have never seen the Lord had they not welcomed the stranger. How terrible it would be for any of us to not recognize him in the breaking the bread because we didn't welcome the stranger in our midst. I love that idea of God coming to earth in the angels. You never know, so always cover your bases. But I'd like to share with you something, a wonderful byproduct of the ministry of hospitality. About 10 years ago, within the course of 6 months or so, 2 young men came to the church up there in Wheeling, and they were welcomed. One was an inactive Catholic. He hadn't gone to church since he was in high school, and he was very nervous about coming back. Do I sit? Do I stand? What do I do? Where's the missal at? What do you know? Blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. The other young man wasn't baptized. He was a pagan, pure and simple. He had tried lots of different religions and philosophies, but they were welcomed warmly when they got there, and somebody at some point said, "Hey, how about coming a part of the RCIA?" The one who was already Catholic took it as a refresher and felt incredibly as a part of the community. The other got himself baptized. And who are these men? Well, one is Father Chuck McGinnis, the associate pastor of Immaculate Conception in Clarksburg, and the other is Father Douglas Ondeck, the associate rector of the cathedral in Charleston. These men became priests, not because of some billboard that said we need more priests. They became priests because somebody saw Christ in them and welcomed them. So how are we really doing with hospitality here at Fatima? You really want to know? Find a stranger in here this morning and ask him.